Dr. Jean M. Twenge, such a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for joining us on Let's Parent on Purpose today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I actually came across your somebody promoting your book. I don't even know if you know them. Dr. Anthony Bradley, who's a professor at King's College, was tweeting about your book, and I was really fascinating and started hunting it down. But it is coming out April 25th. So by the time this podcast comes out, you'll be about 1 month into it. Can you tell us about Generations, this book that you're releasing?
Yeah, so it's about all six living American generations. And there's so much data now on how generations differ. We don't have to guess anymore. And so I brought all of that together, across so many different areas: parenting, politics, mental health, religion, the workplace, and really going on the idea that changes in technology have the biggest impact on generational differences. So, not just smartphones and social media, but also washing machines and airplanes and air conditioning and all of these things that make our lives so different from people who lived 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement, and it's an interesting thesis because first off, your book is data driven. This isn't just hunch, so that's a good thing for somebody to understand. Is you've done a tremendous amount of research um, behind what you're coming to. But I think in general, when people think about generations, they tend to think about what was the big event that characterized that generation. Would that be accurate? Like that's kind of the general way that people frame who generations are and why they are the way they are?
Yeah, that's certainly the classic theory. The idea is that you experience certain major events at different ages, and that's what causes generational differences. But, with a few exceptions, major events really don't have that much of an impact on day-to-day life, on values, on personality traits, on a lot of behaviors. What makes living now, so different is all of the technology that we use and experience. Just one example. So I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 1971. So if I had been instead born in 1871, I sometimes think about what my life would have been like. Utterly, completely different. And the one example, for whatever reason, I keep coming back to is the way people used to have to do laundry by heating water over an open fire in a big kettle. And it would take all
Wow.
day. And usually, all the women in the household would be participating. And now we just throw stuff in a washing machine and go relax.
That is insane to think about. One of the I've thought through that process before, and I wonder, in the grand scheme of things, do we do more laundry or less laundry today? Because it's time saving. But I imagine if it took heating up and boiling water and doing all of that, you're probably not doing a couple loads every single day of your life. But even the rhythm of doing laundry would be radically different for somebody 100 years ago versus right now, or even any time in the last 50 years, right?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. We have higher standards now for cleanliness, let's just say, in every way. Um, but the time saving is so enormous
Hmm.
for that, and just and everything else of having an oven, having running water, having a refrigerator, just all of these things save people who live now so much time compared to the way it used to be of just it took so much time just to survive.
Sure. Yeah. And survival is a big way to put it. They weren't trying to maximize every life decision, they were trying to make it for most of human history. And now, I don't know. I think a lot of times, a lot of the problems that we have now are invented because as a human race, we've gotten the basic survival stuff down pretty good. And so now we can worry about things that no other generations have ever had to even consider worrying about, because when you're trying to do basic food and shelter, you don't get to like, have I achieved my highest potential in life? So um, we are facing, I think, maybe some new challenges because of that convenience.
I think that's exactly right. And so one of the things that technology allows is more individualism. So more focus on the self and less on others. And that has a lot of downstream effects. And one of them is what you're describing, that if you compare your own life to that of, say, your grandparents or great grandparents, you have a lot more discretionary time. Most people do.
Hmm.
And that means you have the time to reflect on things like that of, what's my purpose in life, instead of, your parents sent you out for an apprenticeship and that was it. You didn't have as many choices as we do now.
Yeah, and choices are great until they're not. I've been reading through it. It's not a brand new book, but just recently came across the paradox of choice, and just talking about how you reach this critical threshold where there are so many choices available in so many areas of life that it starts producing anxiety and a sense of loss, because how could you possibly make the best choice all the way around? And again, this is not something, my grandma just passed away a couple of years ago. This is not something she was wrestling through in her childhood and teenage years growing up, going through the Great Depression and the beginnings of World War II. Uh, you start your book right with that generation. I don't know if you started, but the adult generations we're talking about. Um, uh, how many are there that you catalog in your book?
So there's six, and I start with the silent
Okay.
generation, those born
Okay.
1925 to 1945.
Okay. So that's my grandma's generation. And you go from the silent generation. I know a couple of these offhand. I know the boomers, and I'm a Gen Xer, and there's the millennials. I'm missing some though, I think.
So Gen Z, so that's
Okay. Oh
people
yeah, yeah,
born
yeah.
1995 to 2012. So
Hmm.
for a lot of us, those are our kids or teens or young adults.
Right. Yeah. I have 3 Gen Zers and I forgot about them already. That's what works.
They'll
So
forgive you.
yeah, they'll need to, because they're going to need a ride somewhere today.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So silent generation, boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. And these are just the adult generations. Now, Gen Z, I think these kids are like, the low end of Gen Z is in middle school, but the older Gen Zs are now in the adult world. And so we have 6 adult generations interacting with one another. Plus, I guess they're called the alphas, for the lack of a better term right now, in elementary, being born still right now up through elementary. Um, what do you find are some of just maybe the most unique things about each generation? If we were going to go through and you were going to pull out your favorite unique aspects of each generation, what are some of the things that jump out to you?
So for silence, it's that the silence were the leaders of the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. That's often associated with the boomers, but that was actually the silence. Their two most famous members, arguably, Martin Luther King and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Okay.
For the boomers, they are known for the 1960s counterculture. Today, they're often perceived as, uniformly rich and powerful, but that's really a misperception. Particularly boomers who didn't go to college are really struggling now, and that's not often talked about. So I'm a Gen Xer, and I think for Gen Xers, what really makes us stand out is we were the last to have an analog childhood
Yeah.
and then the digital adulthood. And I think we were also really the last whole generation to have a unified pop culture experience.
Mm.
And I think that's why the Gen X has a lot of love of pop culture. I mean, older millennials had some of that, but then it started to change and become much more atomized. So for millennials, they really reached the peak of optimism and self confidence that had been growing since the boomers. And one misperception is that they're all broke. They're actually doing very well economically. For Gen Z, I think that the two things that really stand out are how they use a lot of terms for gender that most of their Gen X parents have never heard of, or many of us anyway.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then the one that really stands out for Gen Z is their struggles around mental health.
Mm,
So teen depression started to rise around 2012. So it's not just due to the pandemic. It doubled between 2011 and 2019. So even before the pandemic, this was a huge issue. And Gen Z talks about mental health more, probably because more are suffering, and this is such a huge issue with them.
let's see, 2012. That's right around the time that everybody started picking up something in their hands that was radically different than anything that came before. Where we talk about it being cellular phones, but it really wasn't. It's the first time anybody had a supercomputer with a phone and a camera in their hands, and that's right around that time, right? Right around 2012.
Yeah, exactly. And when I first started to see these trends toward more depression and loneliness and self-harm among teens, I really had no idea what might be
Mm,
causing it. It wasn't aligned with economic trends at all. That's when the US economy finally started to get better, but it did line up with smartphones and social media. The end of 2012 is the first time the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. It's also around the time that teens started spending a lot more time on social media, that it became almost mandatory. It used to be relatively optional. Teens also started spending a lot less time with their friends face to face around that time.
mm.
So the way that teens spent their time outside of school fundamentally changed around that time in a way that's not good for mental health. More time in the bedroom alone scrolling through the phone, less time with friends face to face.
It's interesting because even I have one child in the house that has a phone right now, one that's graduated and out of the house, and the other two, begging for a phone. And the plea that children make, that young teenagers and even children at this point make, is that I need a phone so that I can stay connected to my friends. Um, but at the same time, what you're seeing through your research is, it seems like with the advent and the propagation of everybody having these supercomputer cell phones, they may think they're doing it to connect with their friends, but it's resulting in more isolation, more loneliness, and more disconnection in their life. Would that be accurate?
It is. And, we do have to distinguish a little bit between what's happening at the generational level and then what happens among individuals. So,
Hmm.
at the
Yeah.
generational level, we're seeing this explosion in teen depression, at the time that smartphones and social media became common. And that's important too, because that affects even kids who don't have a smartphone or don't have social media, because then they often feel left out. So, this is what teens tell
Right.
me: they feel like they can't win, whether they're on it or not. So, it does affect everybody. But then you get to the level of, okay, as parents, what do we do, with our kids? I do still think that putting off the smartphone, putting off social media for as long as humanly possible is the way to go.
Hmm.
And that's partially because there are, especially once you get to middle school, okay, kids at that point are going to want to text each other, but get them a phone that doesn't have any capability for social media. So that could be
Right.
a flip phone. It could be like a Gab phone where that doesn't have internet access or the ability to download apps. So then they can have some of that connection, but then they're not exposed to all of the stuff on social media. So that's what we've done for our 13-year-old, for example. She
Yeah.
she has a pared down phone, so there's no possibility of a workaround to get on social media.
That's really good. And we've talked about this on this podcast before, but your old iPhone has tremendous capabilities to become a dumb phone, very customized to what you want it to be. So, like for instance, with my child, my son who has a phone, um, I use the screen controls, and he has no ability to install an app on his own. That's
Exactly.
that's through mine,
Yep.
and there has to be a request for it. He has no social media on his phone. There are screen times of when it becomes just a paperweight at a certain point in the evening. And, even with that, if he needs to call the only thing that his phone can do after that time is call mom and dad, because that tends to be, I think, one of the things that parents freak out. Well, what if my kid's away and they need to get a hold of me? Well, you can use screen time to let them only get a hold of you, but still not dive into things that are going to harm them in the process. But yes, I think that delaying as much as possible, even bribing them to some sense. Like one of the things we've talked about is giving them like a cash incentive of, if you won't get on any social media, we'll give you X amount of money, but I'll give it to you now. And if you want to be on social media, you have to buy that right back, because then, there's a big cost to go in there. So there's a lot of different creative things you can do. But it's certainly easier if you're not the only ones doing it, if you've got some other moms and dads that can help in that way.
Yeah.
So,
And I think that really is the key. We need to work together as parents.
yeah. Now I'm curious, how do you see so we talked about with the silent generation, we kind of walked through each of the things. Technology is kind of the driving change in a lot of these generations. How do you see it affecting the relationships between generations? Whether that be the younger adults with maybe their grandparents' generation, or maybe even, for instance, in the work world, where one generation is now managing the next generation. What are some ways that these relational and even technological differences are playing out in relationships?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of levels to this. So communication, and this is of course a generalization,
Right.
but that the boomer wants to see you face to face, the Gen Xer wants to email you, the millennial wants to send you a text, and the Gen Zer wants to make a TikTok video. And that last one isn't quite true, but it still seems that way sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
There have actually been a couple of news articles about Gen Zers sending in their resume as a TikTok video.
That's hilarious.
So it's not completely off.
Right.
But there are these generation gaps in the communication styles that people have gotten used to that have to be discussed and have to be bridged. And I think there's another piece that is indirectly connected to technology that's led to a lot of misunderstandings among generations, and that's that because technology includes better medical care, we live longer. Mm. And for that reason, the entire developmental trajectory is slowed down from infancy to old age. So kids are less independent and teens are less likely to get their driver's license or have a job. Young adults marry later and have their kids later and settle into their careers later. And then in middle age, many people feel and look younger than their parents or grandparents did at the same age. It's 60 is the new 50 and that idea. And that, leads to a lot of misunderstanding of, the grandparents look at their, millennial grandkids. What do you mean you're 28, not married yet, or this type of thing? And Gen Xers with their Gen Z kids can't believe that our kids don't want to get their driver's license right at 16,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like we did, or have a job or be more independent. And, those trends are not all bad. There's some great things in there. Most people are thrilled that not as many teens are having sex or drinking alcohol. Mm-hmm. But it does mean that they have less experience with independence and decision making once they go to college or the workplace. So that's something I think a lot about as a parent, in terms of, okay, we have the slower life strategy. That's just, how we live now. But what can I do to encourage my kids to develop some of those skills around independence? Send them to sleepaway camp has been a big one. And then with my oldest, she loves being independent. So she had a good friend in 5th grade who moved away across the country. Oh, you want to go visit your friend? Sure, you can fly on a plane alone when you're 11. No problem. Have a great time, because we trust the family. It's mm-hmm. just a plane flight we're thinking about. And yeah, you can do that. She loved it. It was one of her favorite experiences.
I really like that. I have talked to a number of people from my generation who are now Gen X, who are now in the supervisory positions, and a lot of times this is older millennials as well. And one of their comments about young people coming into the work world is that they want freedom and autonomy before they have achieved competency in things, and so they want kind of the maximum perks that come with what you should get after you've kind of earned your keep in being in a position long enough to be really good at it. Is that just like an anecdotal thing, or is that something that you see play out in some of the research, even just in like how I guess it would be Gen X right now, views entry level jobs that they're going into, in like not entry level like I'm 15 working at McDonald's or Chick-fil-A, but I'm early 20s jumping into the career world. Do you see a mentality difference between them and maybe previous generations?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that show up, in the data about the differences in the workplace. So, one is as you mentioned. So, yes, we have a slower life strategy, but we also have an information culture where we're used to things happening really quick. So this is clearly a generational difference. So like some managers have done things like, okay, instead of having the structure where you're going to have a promotion every 2 years, let's have promotions every 6 months that are smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a way to retain employees. Or let's not have the annual review. Let's do that more often. Another thing that comes up a lot, partially just based on the structure of education, and also maybe not having as much of that independence and decision making. I see this in my undergraduates who I teach, and then I hear about this from managers a lot too. Structure. You have to spell out for these younger employees exactly what you want done, and it can't be, oh, go do this, and they'll be able to do that as independently. Doesn't seem to be the case. Now, once you do that, they do great. I've certainly found that with my students. My Gen Z students are pretty hardworking, and they're also really nice, like noticeably. And that shows up in the survey data too, interestingly, because this generation is more likely to say that they want to help others and that they want a job where they can help others. So I think that's a big opportunity, if that's applicable to the business you're in. You have a generation who's very interested in helping others.
Mm-hmm. I will tell you, I've been a youth pastor for over 20 years at this point. So my very first group was my same generation, barely, the very tail end of the Gen Z, and then I had millennials and Gen Xers. And I will tell you, I'm certainly not doom and gloom about this Gen X generation, because I've found them, many of them, to be real go-getters, where they are producing some things with a level of creativity and independence that really is top quality. But I also see kind of a basket of other things with them that wasn't the case before. So one of those is anxiety and depression, as we've talked about, which is much higher. The other, in general, and I think you talk about this quite a bit in your book, is compared to all of the other generations, less and less identification with any kind of traditional or any religion at all, certainly Christianity, and a greater identification with gender identity and sexuality as like a core piece of who they are. Is that, and it feels like it is pretty a pretty marked difference in Gen X, even than the generation, the millennials above that. Is that what you see? Is that there's a pretty marked difference in those things, even just in that one generation gap?
Yeah, you definitely see that. So in the book, in generations, I cover this in the millennial chapter simply because they seem to have really started the significant decline. So at least say you look at teens, you look at young adults, there's been a steady decline in the number of people who ever attend religious services, who affiliate with the religion. Most people still do, but there's a decline in those who affiliate. And then the other piece too is, for a while people say, okay, fine, there's that decline, but private religious observance hasn't changed. Well, that's not true anymore either, because there's also now a decline for example, among young adults who say they ever pray, who say they believe in God, who think the Bible is the inspired word of God. All of those, have gone down in the last 15 years or so. And you see a generation gap too. If you look even at 1 year, there's a pretty big generation gap. So for prayer, almost all silent generation say they pray at least sometimes. And then for Gen Z, it's more like 72%. So most do,
Mm.
but there's a pretty pronounced decline there.
I don't know if your research got into this at all. Did you get into the whys behind that? Why do we think, or why is it the case that with each of these generations, they are becoming less and less religiously affiliated, and even on a personal level, not just affiliated with organized religion, but even in personal practice, it seems like it's diminishing with each generation. Was your research going after the why of that at all?
Yeah, so it was able to do that in one paper with some great collaborators who do work on psychology and Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And what we really concluded there is that religion is not very compatible with individualism. And individualism is just really, really grown, just much more focused on the self, less on others. There's clear upsides to individualism. But by definition, religious observance and practice and belief means you're believing in something bigger than yourself. Most religions also ask something of you, of following certain rules or doing certain things. And that's sometimes difficult to square with an individualistic point of view. There's a couple of sources I drew from authors who looked into this really carefully, and I have a couple of quotes from people they interviewed in there. Things like, "Whatever you feel, it's personal. Everybody has their idea of God and what God is. You have your own personal beliefs, is what's acceptable for you and what's right for you personally." So you can count the number of times personal comes up in that. It's very much the idea of I want to do what I want to do, and that doesn't always fit with religion all that well.
I don't like to be a doom and gloom person. I don't think I am, but it feels like if you're following a long-term trend towards more and more individualism, at some point that can't be healthy for a collective society that needs to have some kind of communal self-sacrifice, even if you take off the religious aspect together. Does this feel like something that that you anticipate is just going to continue in this trajectory, or do you see anything that would make you think that at some point we're going to hit the bottom of individualism and rebound towards maybe more others focused and service before self, or even that like the needs of the community do trump my own decision to be whoever I want, whenever I want, wherever I want as the greatest value of my life?
Well, it remains to be seen, but I think if you look at Europe and young people in Europe, it suggests that the decline is probably going to continue. But you're right. People need to feel belonging. They need fellowship. So that is something that people are going to seek elsewhere. Then, a lot of times these days, that's online. People need a sense of meaning, so they're also seeking that elsewhere. And so I think there's been lots of people who have thought about this even more deeply than I have, who have argued for politics even becoming the new religion almost. And we'll see if that continues.
Yeah. That was, speaking of politics, that was one of the things that jumped out, that you're the first person I've ever noticed mention that. I'm sure you're not the first person to mention it, but that Joe Biden is the first silent generation president. How in the world did that happen? Joe Biden is pretty old. How in the world is he the first silent generation president? What happened there? Just they all skipped around that generation?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So George H.W. Bush, so the elder, he's like right on the cusp between the greatest generation and silence.
Okay.
But he fought in World War II, so I think we could put him pretty squarely in the greatest generation just by his life experience. And then it went to Bill Clinton, who's a boomer, right away. And then we had 4 boomer presidents?
Yeah,
in a row.
Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump.
That's right.
Trump's still a boomer too, right? Barely, but he's
correct.
a boomer.
Yeah. So 3 of those were all born in the summer of 1946.
Okay. Wow. But at the same time, that silent generation, they're hanging around in every other political arena. It seems like, whether it's Supreme Court or Congress or senators, they seem to be pretty well represented in all of the other realms, don't they?
In Congress, yes. So in senators, the silent generation has done perfectly well in terms of
Mm-hmm.
representation. Not the Supreme Court. If I remember correctly, I think they're almost gone for the Supreme Court, or only have
Yeah.
one left.
Yeah. All right. I am curious. That was just kind of a rabbit trail because I thought about that silent generation, but I'm curious. Circling back around, um, we were talking about how it feels like in general this trajectory of individualism is going to continue, and much of this does seem to be technology based as individual life um, gets easier because of the advent of technology, all the way from the washing machine to, the cell phone. Um, and now we're right on the cusp of artificial intelligence. And I have no idea what that's actually going to, like, it feels like the Wild West with that. But that's in general. There's going to be this general trend of probably even more hyper individualistic living, which is going to have some, there's going to be some good things that come out of that, but societally, it's going to be perhaps more of a challenge. But let's take it back down to a mom and dad that are listening to this right now. They're still in the midst of raising their kids. Maybe they still have some in the house. Maybe some of them are now graduated and out. What do I do as a parent with the information that you have gathered together and published in your book through all of your research? What has it made? You're a mom. What has this led you to do, and what would you recommend to other parents to do with the kind of information you've got?
Yeah. So, obviously the book is wide ranging and is looking across all these generations and so on. But just maybe because I'm a Gen X mom with 3 Gen Z kids, the everyday struggle with technology is always front of mind. And so that's really probably the number one piece of advice that I give is based on the work of sleep experts. And it's do not have your phone or devices in your bedroom overnight. And that's for you and for your kids, if at all possible. And for most teenagers, that's pretty possible, and middle school and kids and so on. Get it out of the bedroom, put it on a charger downstairs or away from the bedrooms at night. And then many people, when I say this, wait, I have to have my phone in my bedroom overnight because it's my alarm clock. So I have some advice for you. Buy an alarm clock. You can buy it on Amazon on your phone and then put your phone away and get a good night's sleep.
Mm-hmm. It's so simple, but I need something to be complex.
Right. And, the stuff around technology, it is complex. Kids have school laptops with YouTube on them. Mine do anyway. That's the bane of my existence. You can't put parental controls on a school laptop. So, Mom, I'm doing my homework. Well, I can't be over their shoulder all the time. My youngest kid's 11. They're not 4 anymore. It is challenging. And I'm not going to tell folks that it's easy, but I think the good news is there are some common sense solutions, especially around sleep, but also just in trying to postpone smartphones and social media for as long as possible.
Yeah, I love that. I'm amen right on with that. So, Jean, thank you so much for your time. Your book, Generations, what's the best way? We said Amazon. I'm sure that's a great way for people to get it. Is there a way? I always like to ask authors this. Is there a way for those who are listening to purchase this book that is even more lucrative for you than Jeff Bezos getting his cut on Amazon?
It's really all about the same. I mean, if you can get in an independent bookstore, that's of course always awesome, but the convenience of online, of course, can't be beat. I will mention I do have a website, jeantwenge.com. So it's JeanTwenge.com. And that has not just the books, but frequently asked questions about generations, information on speaking engagements, academic publications, and all kinds of stuff.
All right. I'm going to dig into that myself. And I really appreciate your time. I love learning about this stuff. And sometimes it's gathering information. And then after a while, you know what to do with it as you just become more well informed of the people that are in and around your life. So thank you for the hard work you put into making this accessible for moms and dads and everybody else.
Thank you. And thanks for having
Mhm.
me.